When the bull charged, the brave cowboy saved a child from danger. The sentence hung in the air like a bell struck in a quiet town. It would be said 1,000 ways before the week was out, in doorways and at wells. But the memory that mattered was the way the world narrowed to dust and a pair of strangers' hands. On a sun-scorched afternoon when the cottonwoods barely stirred and the prairie rolled like breath, a wagon lurched, a bonnet ribbon unspooled, and a baby's small fist opened and closed against the hard, hot air. That single motion sent a new kind of urgency across the valley. Rowan Hail noticed the trouble before he could name it. He'd been riding Thunder along the low fence line, the horse's mane a dark banner in the heat, checking for broken rails. Small, steady work that kept him out of the tavern and away from his old excuses. The day had the brittle clarity of late summer. Iron glinting on a gate latch, the smell of parched grass, flies that landed and left. He had the habit of listening for things. On the prairie, that was as useful as knowing how to tie a bowline. At first, it was not thunder, but a high single note, more animal than human, cutting the flat. A bellow that did not match the placid herd he'd seen days ago near the river. Then the ground began to speak, hoofs rising like a tide. A bull had broken loose. Perhaps it had been spooked by a coyote or a snake, perhaps struck by the heat. These were guesses that would be revised in the telling. What mattered in that loose instant was the bull's charge and the way it pulled everything after it. The wagon was a red smear on the horizon, a family wagon bouncing along the road toward the settlement. There were people on the wagon, Tom Breslin at the reins, a woman in a shawl, a child tucked in her lap. Rowan saw the bonnet suddenly lose its hold, the infant lean, the small body slide, and then the world condensed to motion. A fall, a gasp, a flash of white against red dust. Hoofs were already a dawn of iron on the prairie. Rowan did not think. He rode. Thunder answered. The horse moved as if they'd shared a plan of their own, claws of muscle and lung and bone. Dust flew up, a cloud that swallowed sound. Rowan plunged through the falling sky of hoofs. The smell was iron and dust and horse sweat. The air cut his eyes until tears came, not from pain but from grit and the sharpness of living. He saw a hand, Clara Winslow's hand, reach for nothing. He heard Tom's shout as a riven sound. He leaned from his saddle, felt Thunder's ribs under him, reached, and then his fingers closed around a small bundle that was parts breath and wild hot life. June was lighter than he expected, until she wasn't, until the forward jerk, the rearing of bodies, the sudden treacherous lurch that set Rowan almost from his seat. He clutched the child to his chest and pulled back toward the rim of steer and wagon, as if hauling himself up the side of a cliff.
He rode through a seam in the herd that the bull, blinded by its own motion, left open for the space of a breath. It was a narrow seam, a terrible, perfect seam. Thunder spilled, then leaped, and Rowan found himself at the wagon's flank, June in his arms, Thunder of the herd fading behind like a receding storm. The rescue made a small shape of the day. One man on a horse with blood on his knuckles from a wire fence, one child tucked to a man's sternum, a woman on her knees in the dust with her hands clasped in a prayer that held no sound for a minute. Clara's lipstick-marked lips trembled when she reached June and took her back, small and furious with life. There was a look between Rowan and Clara then that did not belong to strangers. It belonged to people who had seen how thin the thread of a day could be. Tom Breslin's jaw worked. He swore softly, a man who had thought only of the road and found himself in a theater of near death. Around them the others gathered, neighbors who'd come running, faces powdered with dust, voices thick with the same tremor. Santos, who had been mending a fence 2 farms over, arrived on a borrowed mule, hair white at the temple and hands the color of old leather. He had steadiness in him, the kind that smells of boiled coffee and tar on a well-used tool. He set about what had to be done: water, cloth, a shelter away from sun, and the hot, prodding curiosity of children. Rowan's hands were still damp with June's breath. He couldn't tell at first whether he had more adrenaline or more cold. His knees turned to wood as the neighbors made a way for the Winslow wagon toward the Hail ranch, toward the lean, low house where lamplight and the smell of boiled coffee would do what it could for a child's small scrapes, and the larger thing, fear, that came with a near death. At the ranch, Clara accepted the blanket Rowan offered without quite meeting his eyes. Her fingers smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. A widow's smell, he thought. Not any judgment, only the fact of it. She'd become used to carrying absence. June's hair had a dusting of grit that the saturating water could not take out. Rowan knelt and washed the child's face with careful movements that were not above reverence. He had a practice in careful hands. He had learned how to hold a small life steady because he had once failed to hold one. A memory came then, sudden and raw. The river that had taken his boy, a low bank slick with mud, a child's body that drifted and would not be pulled back. Rowan tasted river water in his mouth, cold and small, and the shadow closed over a part of him he only kept for himself. He did not tell Clara about the river. He did not need to. She only noticed how he paused when the wind made the cottonwood leaves slap like soft hands against a window. She would learn the edges of him in time, if there were a time. The immediate needs, always, are plain. Santos brewed coffee in an iron pot and set it near the stove.
Lamplight braced the room, throwing the corners into small islands and warming the faces of those who watched. A child by the name of June slept the thin sleep that follows a too close thing, eyelids fluttering like wings. Tom sat on the step and drank coffee as if liquid could iron out his nerves. Clara sat with June in her lap, and when she finally exhaled, the whole room seemed to tilt toward her. "You did good," she said to Rowan. It was not much. It was the plainest gratitude, a thing shared without drama. Rowan felt under it the gravity of something else, a debt that would not easily be written off. Clara's hand found June's head and smoothed the dust into the child's curls. People leave marks in one another's lives by how they act when the world narrows. Rowan's action left a mark on Clara that would stay and find shape in 100 small acts, mending a fence, taking a crate of eggs to market, bringing a piece of rope when a gate hinge broke. He was a man who answered when trouble closed in. She was a woman whose life had been lived with one hand steady and the other always keeping watch for what might be missing. The hour after the rescue moved with the rhythm of ordinary things doing extraordinary work. Santos stitched a small scrape on June's knee with a steady hand and a strip of white cloth that smelled faintly of soap. The Hail house shined in a way that small household labors make. A pan of potatoes simmered, the smell curling into the night. A mended sleeve lay drying by the stove. Rowan and Clara sat at the same table and talked with a careful economy. They did not tell their whole lives. They spoke in soft edges at first, small claims of the self. Where they were born, who taught them to read the weather, which ridge had good soil. There are manners for starting over without claiming the thing fully. The manners are made of small, useful truths. Rowan listened with that sharpness that had saved June. He had not been without affection all his life. He had been without resolution. The grief that pressed him into action was a thing with polite edges in the house. He kept a pocket knife in the same drawer, a photograph too small to frame, an old cap he did not wear in public. Clara was not the map out of him. She was a landscape he might cross if he chose to stay. He felt that choice the way a man feels a storm on the lip of the valley, incoming and certain. It was Santos who first spoke of the threat that lay beyond the day's close, a worry that had been moving like a dry wind through the valley for some time. He had been out early that morning, he said, and seen fresh tracks near the Duncan spring, tire prints and horse hooves, the signs of men looking with intent. "Consensicades are talking again," Santos said. He leveled the words for the others. The name had weight. Dawson Consensicade owned more land than any man in the county, and had men with lines in more places than a web. He was a man whose money had teeth.
At the mention of Consensicade, the room changed. Conversation narrowed to a practical murmur. Tom, who had been steady in the crisis of the wagon, now chewed his lip. The valley had known pressure with the slow, insidious certainty of drought, offers to sell, cattle grazing where they had no license to graze, small fires set to a barn that would not be called an accident by those who blamed them. Now, after the day that a newborn could have been taken, the anger had a common direction. "It ain't only the Duncans," Maggie Duncan said, and set forward as if she might be taken from her chair and set on her feet by the force of her own words. Thomas Duncan, her husband, frowned and folded his arms over the gray of his shirt. The Duncans were neighbors whose spring was the one everyone in the upper valley depended on in dry months. If a man like Dawson could coerce them, he could make the valley a corridor of his influence. Fear had already been a presence in their houses. It was an unwelcome but accustomed guest. Marshal Briggs came the next day, his hat heavy with the sun, and his coat smelling faintly of the road. He had a lawman's gait, not in the stiff official sense, but the way a man carries the certainty of duty, even when the task will be made trying by a rich man who believed he should bend things to his will. Briggs had listened to the story of the afternoon, the bull, the charge, Rowan's hands, and he watched these people with the careful patience of one who must weigh words. He spoke plainly. We can't meet force with force, not if we want this valley to keep its bones. We have to prove what's being done and let the law do the rest. Rowan agreed with the law in principle. He had no taste for the law being absent, but he also knew the law was a slow thing with the teeth of a season. He'd read about how cases could be bought off at county seats, how influence blackened the scales sometimes, and the knowledge sat in him like a shadow. The rescue that had put him in Clara's debt also made him acutely aware of the vulnerability around them. A child nearly lost in the open felt like a summons to answer, and to answer meant more than one man's fist. They called the neighbors, Maggie and Thomas Duncan, the Winslow family, all newly settled, other ranchers with weathered faces or the tight lines of those who had not slept well in months. The meeting was held in the Hail barn because it was the only place large enough, and because a barn has a practical democracy. Anyone with a stake in the nails could speak. The barn smelled of horses and old hay, the rafters like ribs. A lantern hung and swayed as men and women spoke in the low, serious voice people use when they know the world is tilted. Rowan stood and outlined what the valley needed: witness lists, a rotating watch, records of damage, sworn statements filed with the marshal. There was a way to make a paper of what once had been simple and private.
We keep our eyes open, we keep our mouths honest, and we bring what we see straight to Briggs, he said. There was authority in how he spoke, not from a title, but from the steadiness of a man who had crossed himself to be where he needed to be at the exact hour. Skepticism rose like dust at first. The valley had for generations tended its own fences in its own way, and a call to keep watch felt unnerving, like admission of fear. But fear had teeth in it now, a name and a shape. Maggie Duncan, with the fierce face of someone used to arguing with frost for a season's worth of crops, did not balk. We keep watch, she said. We watch the spring, the paths, and the roads. We testify what we see. If someone's setting fires or men are going around scaring folk, then we stop it together. Briggs will take statements. That's how we keep ourselves from going to the rope. There was a kind of resolve in the barn. They set up a roster by a nail on the wall. Santos at first light, Thomas Duncan and 2 others at the midday watch, Rowan for the long hours when the prairie cooled and men with ill designs favored the shade and the cover of night. Clara hesitated before putting her name on the list. She had a child to think of. There was prudence in that. But she looked at June, sleeping in a fold of cloth that smelled slightly of the Hail kitchen's biscuits, and put her name down. The act of writing her name was small and the weight of it large. The watches began with the practiced stiffness of people not used to sleeping in turns. They took shifts and walked the boundary lines with lanterns, measuring the night by the way the lamplight licked the cottonwood leaves. The sounds of the valley at night were different from the day: the owl's call, the distant lowing of cattle, the river's faint voice. Under this soundtrack, the watch felt noble and fragile in equal measure. Rowan would go out alone sometimes and stand with thunder at the fence, feeling the horse's breath fog in the early cool, and thinking of the child by the river he had not been able to save. The first real evidence of escalation arrived not as Blair but as a mask, a small outbuilding at the Duncan place, scorched on one side. No one had seen the men come. Maggie found the singe marks the next morning, black on the wood like the thumbprint of a fist. There were no charred beams, nothing to tell anyone that the intent had been to frighten rather than to destroy, the kind of message a powerful man would send without appearing to have burned a barn. The Springs guards found old footprints that were foreign. These were the things that made Briggs's jaw tighten. You take what you can to the county clerk, Briggs told them after he had looked at the burned beam and the footprints. You swear to it. Get your statements down. We'll get deputies out. I can't promise they'll move as fast as we'd like, but it's a start.
He looked at Rowan with a kind of appraisal that understood how one act could shape the rest. And you, Hale, keep doing what you do, but don't let this turn us into a lawless place. If we take men into our hands, we lose ground. Rowan knew the ground he did not want to give up. He also knew the place where a man like Dawson Consincade could buy a delay and turn a courthouse into something that bent. It was a bitter thought, but it was true enough to carve itself in his chest. He had seen money move like wind, scattering the small claims of men who had less than weight. So he and the others did the things that would, if they were looked at honestly, create the paper trail
to back vigilances up with law, sworn statements, photographs taken with the box camera that Thomas Duncan had borrowed from a cousin, lists of times, the names of men seen moving in the night. Yet paper is slow. It is like planting beans in a dry furrow and hoping the rain will come. People needed immediate assurance. The valley built small things to hold the threat at bay: bolted latches, shorter routes for wagons, extra men at the spring during the noon hours, when the sun was highest and men with plans would avoid travel. They took to bringing their children indoors at dusk. They taught the little ones what to do if someone knocked rough and asked for something suspicious. It was funerary education, dressed as homework. This new regime pressed on Clara in ways Rowan did not at first see. She watched June with a peculiar intensity, measuring each breath and each move like someone learning to read the weather. Sometimes she would sit by the window and watch the road, her hands idle in her lap. Once, when she thought no one watched, Rowan saw her untie a small scrap of ribbon and tuck it into her bodice like an offering. He would later understand that she was making a small pact, to stay, to build, to hold. Rumors swirled, as rumors will. Men at the store said they'd seen Dawson Consincade's son, Garrett, riding with two rough-looking men down toward the South Ridge. A cattleman on the far side of the valley said he'd had his hay pushed by a gang of horses that seemed led by men not from around. Gossip has a bad habit of shaping truth before truth arrives. Still, the pattern was consistent enough to cost everyone sleep. The valley's weeks folded into the same pattern of watch and testimony. The Hail place became an unlikely kind of council. At nights, after the watches were set and the lanterns put away, people would come to the barn to talk. They spoke of legal papers and of farms, but also of small things that kept their hearts from hardening, stories of births and of funerals, a recipe for a corn pudding Maggie swore by, who could mend a collar quick for $1. These small swatches of ordinary living were not a diversion, they were a defense.
The valley was not simply a collection of claims and fences. It was a lattice of human habits and shared labor, and the men who had wealth had not yet learned the value of such habits. Rowan moved through those days like a man exercising a muscle that had been frequently unused. He checked fences and rode the perimeter, but he also propped up a ladder for Maggie one afternoon and took the time to stitch a tear in Clara's apron by lamplight. The stitches were not a romance so much as an apprenticeship in a future that might be possible. Clara watched him work with a practical curiosity and then returned the favor when he needed his boot leather oiled. They were not lovers yet. They were people trading services, and in the exchange, beginning to trust. Yet trust is a piece of fragile material, stretched tight by events. On a late afternoon, when the sky had the pearly light that means a storm might be forming, a rider came into the valley with a face like a man who had ridden hard to keep two things in balance. He was a stranger in a familiar coat, and he brought a message that tightened the valley's chest. "Dawson Consincade sent word to an agent down in town," the rider said, shaking the dust from his hat. "They say the valley contractors are being offered cash to sell. They say the Duncans have been spoken to. If they're not agreeable, other pressures come." The man looked at Rowan and then at Briggs. "And there's talk of taking someone as a show." Briggs's expression hardened. A show. The phrase carried a cruelty. It meant humiliation manufactured to look like order. It meant a man could be made into an example to cow others. The image was like a hot stone dropped into cold water. It spread shock. That night the valley kept more watches. The lamplight seemed to hang on the air like a promise. Rowan stood at the fence with Thunder, feeling the horse's breath and thinking of the river he'd lost a child to. He thought of other men who had used their weight to lift or to crush. He thought of the thin wire that binds men to law and neighborliness. He thought of the baby in Clara's arms and how close it had been. Santos found him then, leaning on the rail. "You did good, boy," the older man said, not yet calling him by the simple name Rowan, as if claims on people should be earned. "That child would have been gone if not for your hands." Rowan swallowed. "It was the horse as much as me. Thunder knows his work." Thunder nuzzled his shoulder, a wet thumb on a bruise. Rowan let the man have the comfort. He had not always been a hero. He had been a man who had been given a second measure of action and used it. He had saved a child. That fact now vibrated through the valley like a wire through which light traveled. They kept watch into the night, and the night held its breath. Lanterns burned and guttered. The cottonwoods clattered in a wind that moved like fingers.
The image of the bull's charge would be recounted many ways in the coming days, each telling a slightly different shape. But this was the true shape, that one man rode into a storm, not because he wanted to, but because the world had demanded it of him, and his answer altered the lives of the people around him. By the time dawn whitewashed the fields, the valley felt more awake to itself. Statements were drawn up and sent with Briggs to the county seat. Rowan and Clara sat for a long time after, hands busy with small repairs, pulling nails, retying a strap, acts of slow reparation that settled the tension in them. Around them, people mended fences, repaired singed planks, and stacked wood. Work had always been a method of making history tolerable. Now it was the fabric by which they'd hold the valley. But paper and work are not defenses against men who believe themselves to be inevitable. Weeks passed, and small aggressions became patterns. A herd grazed too close to a fence under cover of a moonless night. A shipment of feed went missing from a lean-to. Then, one dawn, a hand-lettered placard was nailed to a fence at the road. Sell or be forced. It was not a direct threat by name, but its meaning was clear. A gentle extortion dressed in the clothes of a warning. Rowan read it, felt the bitterness like a coal in his throat, and tore it down. He did not do so out of hope of ending the campaign. He did it because to let such words rot on a fence meant letting fear win a small victory. He and Thomas Duncan and a group of men burned the placard and took its ashes to the river, where they scattered them. It was no law. It was a ceremonial thing, a small stake planted in the ground to say they would not surrender the valley simply because a man with money wanted to run it. Briggs arrived then, with a thinner smile and news that must be weighed with the common hunger for justice. "We can file on these," he said, "but we have to be careful. Dawson Consincade has options. Prosecutors listen to evidence and to money. If you've got witnesses, men who will swear an oath to seeing men near your lands, if you can bring that, then we can move. If not, it's hard to keep a man from moving his cattle or his men near you." Rowan and the others understood the calculus. They set to work in 1,000 small ways to create a record, watch rotations, logged times, a ledger of damages. They taught their children to be honest about what they'd seen, which was perhaps the hardest part for parents, asking a small child to tell the truth about strangers at night. The valley's life became a ledger and a prayer. Amid these practicalities, the private lives continued to accrue. Clara learned to bake bread that had a crust like a small heaven. Rowan learned to ask, slowly and with care, whether she might like to plant a row of beans near the fence.
June grew into the rescue story like a small emblem in the community, a living proof that something could be saved when people answered. When she laughed, the whole valley felt the sound as if it were a small bell rung clear. Yet beneath these stitches lay the larger, harder cloth, the sense that the valley had made itself visible to a man for whom such visibility was a resource to exploit. Rowan saw that in how a rider passed the Duncan property at an angle that was not for necessity, in how a man leaned his head at a fence and watched the spring. It was this sighting that would become the spine of what came next. It was not merely cattle and fences and a barn. It was the claim upon the people who lived there. Rowan had always known that bravery is not a thing you polish and set on a mantle. It is a muscle, sometimes overused, sometimes weak. The rescue of June had flexed something strong in him, a readiness to answer when the day called. That readiness was now a resource the valley leaned on, and the valley would in turn have to be careful not to make him its only muscle. One dusk, after a long day of testimony at the county, when the dust had settled and the sun had gone thin, Clara found Rowan at the fence, hands in his pockets, staring across the ridge where the Consincade place lay, like an unasked question. She sat on the rail beside him. The presence between them was companionable without words, a backing of two people who had found a deeper trust than either expected. "You keep looking out that way," she said, half a smile, and her voice had the small, careful humor of someone trying to make light of a worry. "I look at a lot of things I don't like," Rowan said. He could have said more, about the river, about the boy who had once been with him, but he kept it wrapped. "We do what we can." "We will not give it away," she said. It was the simplest of vows, and as night fell, the cottonwoods parted to let lamplight through like a promise, and the valley braced itself for the next shape of trouble it had already glimpsed, the way a soft thing gathers its strength before the storm. They did not yet know the precise form of the pressure that would come. It was the sort of thing that takes its time to reveal itself. A raid planned under cover of a new moon, the steady wearing down of a community's options, a test to see if they would hold together when a man of wealth decided to use threat rather than negotiation. But the valley had found something in the rescue, a reason to act together, and the knowledge that one decisive act could pivot a life and change the course of many. The weeks that followed the placard were full of ordinary labor and shadowy reports. Rowan and Santos won together more than once, checking lines and looking at the river where, once upon a time, the current had taken the boy he had loved.
He did not go down to the river and throw himself into memory. He walked the bank with the stiffness of a man who keeps certain griefs like tools, sharpened and effective, but not brandished. Clara watched him sometimes and put a warm hand on his arm, as if recognizing that grief need not be a thing to be cured. It could be a companion, tolerated and held. The valley was alive with other things. A calf born to Maggie Duncan on a night when the wind had a soft eastward pull, the sound of children playing by an old fence, a neighbor presenting Rowan with a length of rope he'd braided anew for the winter. Tiny acts stitched the place. People began to bring their troubles to the Hail place more as a habit. It became, not by design, but by circumstance, a hub for the uneasy business of staying upright under pressure. It was in one of those hub nights, with the barn's rafters humming with the quiet of men who had learned to listen, that an unmistakable, ugly trial was first near enough to smell, the sight of men on horseback circling a homestead one evening, as if rehearsing a show. They did not come to any door. They came to see who was where and who would move when told. One rider cut close enough to tear a hat from a head, and the effect was a small, calculated cruelty. It was a signal. The valley saw it. It filled with a certain kind of fury, less a wildness and more a sharpened intent. They were no longer simply defending property. They were defending the idea that one man could not bend the lives of a dozen into his will. Rowan felt all of this as a kind of pressure building behind his ribs. He had been a man who'd lived by the rules of the land and of neighborliness. Now he found himself in the position of having to make choices that might shape more than he anticipated. He would not choose the wrong kind of answer. The valley had promised the law and each other to keep within reason. But reason, when pushed, creates a hard edge so that what is soft need not break. The next days held a tighter rhythm. More sworn statements, more night rides, a deputization in practice if not in letter. People sharpened pitchforks and bolstered lanterns. Marshal Briggs met with Dawson Consoncade once, stern and careful and not easily bullied. The meeting at the Consoncade gate was quiet, the kind of confrontation that looks like a polite watering of gardens, while a man with power names the ways he will bend situations. Briggs's face afterwards was unreadable, but the outcome in public was slow and bureaucratic. Promises to look into it, a polite suggestion that tensions be eased. Inside, the valley braced. They were learning the hard lesson that law can be slow, and the slow pulse of formal justice is not always what a community needs when danger looms. So they doubled down on their ordinary acts, mending, cooking, sleeping in turns, and keeping watch.
They learned each other's faces better, how a neighbor's hands trembled when he spoke of men, how a woman's jaw set when her child's future had to be argued for like a claim. Through it all, Rowan kept an eye on June. She was at once the small, heated proof of the rescue and the symbol of what the valley was protecting. On afternoons when the sun sat heavy on the horizon and the lamplight had not yet been lit, he would stand by the fence with Thunder and watch Clara and the child. Sometimes she would catch his gaze and nod, a small acknowledgement like a bell that signaled a safe harbor. Other times she would look away, the image of the child and the ghost of a river mixing into the way she regarded him. They had, for now, created the scaffolding of resistance, testimony, watch, and the paperwork that could ring a bell in a courthouse. The thing they could not yet do was to compel the law to move as they wished. That was a different weather system, the kind that would wash over them with little warning and require them to be ready in ways they were still learning. In the lamplight that night, as the valley closed its shutters and the watch took its post, Rowan thought of the day the bull had charged, of the fraction of a second when a small, fragile life had tipped his whole world. He thought of the way the rescue had become a hinge for the valley, how it had made neighbors spectators and then actors. The valley's future, for now, bent on a fragile hinge between law and will, between restraint and the urge to protect what mattered. Row by row, they would make their stand. He had no illusions about what might come, only the clarity that he would be at the fence when it did. As the cottonwoods whispered and the lamplight bled into the night, the valley made its small, stubborn promise to hold together. They had been given a reason to do so. June's small chest, the warmth of her sleep a bright emblem, and they had no intention of letting it be for nothing. The watch began, and under the sky the prairie spread its slow, watchful body, ready for whatever form the pressure might take next. The watch began, and so did the nights that followed, long, taut, and careful, as if the valley had folded itself around a secret so fragile it needed company to survive. Lanterns burned in kitchen windows, people wrapped shawls close and kept their chairs near doors. The cottonwoods outside the Hail place whispered their soft complaint into the dark. Under that low music, the valley held itself steady, waiting to see what shape the pressure would take next. It took the shape of men riding after midnight. They came on a moonless hour, moving like a shadow the way desperate things move, fast, low, trying not to cast evidence. Garrett Consincate led them, a young man used to getting what he wanted by tilt of brow in the company he kept. He rode with two others in the flat, clean cruelty of someone who'd been trained to think intimidation a tool.
Their plan was no mystery to the people who had been watching the edges. They meant to put a hand on the spring and show the valley they could do as they pleased. And if show failed, they would take something precious to remind the rest of their power. The valley's watchers were not many, but they were awake. Santos saw the riders first, a dark thread against the prairie, the sound of too many horses' breath in a hush. He raised a lantern, and it shivered like a held promise. Others lit theirs in answer. The riders did not scatter. They moved with the arrogance of a thing rehearsed and considered, thinking the night their cloak. They rode close enough to toss a stone toward the Duncan spring, to show they knew its place. That affront would have been enough for many. For Garrett and his men, it was bait. A plan had been made in whispers, to march to a homestead and drag a woman out as a warning, to make a spectacle that would crease consciences into compliance. The valley, watching, felt a cold bloom of something else, the need to act before spectacle could be staged. Rowan was at the fence when the first torches flared. He heard the horse hooves at a different rhythm now, less stray, more deliberate. He lifted thunder through the dark like a hand taking hold of something urgent. Lamplight and the smell of boiled coffee from the kitchen followed him. This was the net the valley had woven around itself, ordinary things brought as defense. Rowan had thought a great deal lately of the sort of man who uses weight to bend others. He had no desire to become one, but neither would he stand where the cliff could drop others. They moved with care. The plan had been to keep the law involved. Briggs had sworn to send deputies if the valley could provide proof and make a show of community restraint. Yet nothing about danger respects neat procedures. The riders knew the marshal's patience would be a thing that could be outrun if the moment was quick and cruel. So the valley made a second plan, to take the attackers if they could without letting rage decide what came next. The raid began near midnight. Lanterns bobbed in response like distant stars dropping lower to meet the earth. Men stepped out from behind sheds and moved like something rehearsed themselves, small teams, quiet and ready to hold without killing. They wanted to prevent theft and terror, to end the event in the clean way people call lawful, by taking the law's evidence in hand and bringing it to the one whose duty was to make it whole. Garrett and his men came to the Hail barn first, where June slept in a small cot, and where Clara had set up a few spare quilts against a chill. The men thought to make a scene at a homestead. They wanted the pulling out of a woman for spectacle, the shaming to be public. They did not count on the barn's rafters smelling like horses and packed human breath, or on the quiet readiness of a police braced by many little acts.
They rode up with torches blinking, the light throwing quick, hard shapes on wood and dust. One of the men reached for the latch on the barn door. The valley's answer was immediate and measured. Men stepped out, a knot of neighbors with ropes and iron in hand, but not to cut throats. They moved to block doorways, to take reins, to drop the lights to the ground. The barn became a stage of controlled refusal. The attackers found themselves facing the clear, bright force of a common no. Garrett, near enough to smell the hay and the sweat and the coffee, misread the measure. He mistook the valley's measured certainty for fear. He decided, then and there, to make an example. He shoved at the ribs of a neighbor who stepped into his path, and the shove was the moment things slipped toward a physical clash. Rowan moved into it, like a man moving on instinct, honed by a remembered danger.
He stepped between Garrett and the woman the men had targeted. Clara was standing not far, June in her arms, lamplight around them, and Rowan's body answered before any legal argument could form. He could have taken Garrett's shove and answered with his own anger. Instead, he grabbed a wrist in a lead of rain and pulled Garrett back by the simple force of a man who could not stand to let cruelty find purchase. The scuffle that followed was close, hot and messy, but not theatrical. Fists rose and were blocked by calloused hands. A pitchfork was brandished by a neighbor and then set down by someone who had the steadiness to demand restraint. There was the sharp sound of a lantern kicked and the smell of kerosene like a small danger. It was a thing of fumbling in will rather than of cinematic violence. When the fighting spilled to the yard, Rowan kept his hand between Garrett and the door where Clara stood, his body making a shield of itself. He saw the boy's face through the half-light, Garrett's jaw clenched, the flush of entitlement, and the shock of being met, and he felt something like pity that mixed with the cold correctness of duty. The valley's others acted fast. Maggie and Thomas Duncan had anticipated aggression, and now used their ropes not as tools of execution, but of restraint. Neighbors grabbed at men and held them in place with the firmness of people who had decided together that capture, not vengeance, was the point. The attackers were not many. Surprise had been their ally, but surprise could not do much against a dozen pairs of hands who had known lately that staying together was the only defense. Marshal Briggs, who had been riding in with deputies on word of the riders, arrived while the scuffle was still hot. He came in a flare of law, hat down, coat dusted, voice ablade. He called for order and for names. The valley stepped back, not from cruelty, but from the temptation to handle men as if they were less than the law required. Garrett and 2 of his crew were seized and bound. They could not break the hands that held them.
Briggs had them read their rights in the dry way he always did, making the men feel the weight of the state's gaze. Garrett's face was hot with anger and the rough awareness that he'd been made small. No one in the valley claimed a quick triumph. There were bruises, hands reddened, a face cut with a nick that would leave nothing but a scab and a memory, and there was a child's wide-eyed wakefulness when the commotion had run its course. But there was something else. The sight of men whose plan had been thwarted by the disciplined, stolid choice to take them in and hand them to the law. It would matter, later, in court and in public conscience. The arrests were not a neat end. They were the start of a thread that knit the valley to the courthouse and to the tedious, necessary machinery of justice. Briggs had men to bring to town. Garrett and his companions were loaded into a wagon with their wrists tied, and the slumped silence of men who had imagined themselves above consequence. Dawson Consincade came to the county with a face like a winter day, polite, shaded, bought of bearing. He said nothing in public, and let his son face his shame for a time. Behind closed doors, he set plans in motion he thought would blunt the force of testimony. The valley, meantime, swelled into new resolve. People gathered statements as if they were tending a garden, careful, repeated, and patient. Children who had seen riders were coaxed to tell the truth of what they'd seen. Neighbors sat in Briggs's office and swore on a scratch of paper the story of the night and of the days that had come before. They filed the ledger of their watches and their damages. These were not heroic acts in the romantic sense. They were weighty, plodding things, forms filled, signings in ink, the slow upturning of soil for the seed of process. At the county seat, the case made its way. There was a hearing, then an indictment, and a trial scheduled in a courthouse that smelled of varnish and papers. The trial was the valley's stern, solemn day. The room filled with men and women who had made their living by the land. Their faces were honest and sun-lined, and their voices held a practical kind of courage. Rich men sat in the back, their faces like landscape cut by money, and Dawson Consincade had callers and lawyers. He wore a small, crisp suit, and a look that sought to persuade the world he had been misread. Garrett's defense tried the usual sets of arguments, that he had been misinterpreted, that witnesses were unreliable, that night scenes breed confusion. The valley's counter was plain and human. Thomas Duncan and Maggie, Santos and Tom Burleson took the stand. They spoke of footprints and charred wood, and of the time when a placard appeared nailed to a fence. They spoke of a man who came near the spring, and of horses that came under cover of dark. The prosecution let them speak without ornament. They read sworn statements and displayed the ledger of watches.
They showed photographs from a box camera, grainy prints of men on horseback, a burned board that could not be bought away easily. Rowan took the stand in a way that felt to him less like performance and more like a thing of necessity. He told, simply and plainly, of the bull and the day he had rode into hooves and dust to take June back to a mother. He did not embroider his grief for sake of pathos. He said only what he had seen and done and why.
He told of the night and of Garrett's shove and of how the men had been taken in. His voice was steady and clear, practiced by days of watch and talk, and the jury listened as if to an old, truthful bell. Dawson's lawyers tried to make the valley look small, hysterical, easily moved. They presented letters and a ledger of supposed expenses and argued that Dawson had been pressured by economic forces and that his agents had only been seeking negotiation. They made soft, insinuating arguments about impulsive farmers. But there is power in small, honest testimony. People who live with the land in a measured way do not make theatrical lies. The jurors, who had come from towns and farms and stores across the county, watched a man like Rowan speak and were, in ways that matter in such tribunals, persuaded by the solidness of character. In the end, Garrett was convicted of assault and attempted kidnapping. His companions were found guilty of conspiracy to intimidate and property trespass. The sentences were not sensational: years in the county jail for Garrett, fines and work restitution for others, but they were real. They were the slow, measured punishments of a system that does not always fit when wealth and power seek to bend it. Dawson, for once publicly associated with the matter, felt the cost of exposure. He moved like a man whose easy influence had been roughened by the grit of ordinary testimony. Some of his contracts were rescinded to men who did not want to be seen on his side. A court ordered restitution for damaged fences and for the costs associated with the valley's losses. None of it erased what had happened. It acknowledged it. The legal victory did not mean the valley breathed easy the instant a gavel fell. Law cannot stitch the whole of what gets frayed by coercion. Justice, after all, tends to be procedural, and hard work is something else. But the verdict carried weight. It reduced the Consancade's overt harassment and made men think twice about using fear as a tool. It created a mark in public record that could not be easily erased. For the valley, it was enough to make the nights brighter and the watch less fraught with expectation of a cruelty willed rather than an accident. After the trial, life settled into a new rhythm. There were practical things to do, repairs to be made, fences to replace, wells to clean.
The Hail barn hosted work parties, where men who had once been strangers carried beams and hammered bent nails until the barn looked like the kind of vessel that holds a community together. Maggie Duncan taught a sewing circle that met in the parlor and patched shirts and stories with the same care. Clara found a place in those hands-on ministrations. She became a sort of careful heart inside the valley's mending work. She taught a woman how to bake biscuits until they browned just so. She leaned into the small economies of care, because that was how she could give a life. Rowan kept at his routines. He rode with Santos through the ridges, checking fence lines and talking about crops in the river. Sometimes, when he thought no one watched, he walked to the river and laid his hand on the low bank where the past had taken hold. The river did not give him back what it had taken. It offered instead a steady passing. He learned to stand beside it without reaching for what could not be taken. In those days he carried grief like a weathered tool, not a wound open to sight, but an edge that sharpened his decision-making in the world. Clara and Rowan's relationship grew in measured ways. There were small intimacies, an extra mug of coffee left warm by the stove, a hand laid on a shoulder when fear rose like steam. Rowan learned to ask her about trivial things and mean them. Which seedlings did she prefer? Would she like a new quilt pattern? She learned how his silence contained things, how his jokes were rare and bright. They began to do the quiet work of people building a home, planting a row of beans by the fence, mending a cracked gatepost together in late autumn, leaving a crate of eggs for a neighbor who had had a hard winter. One evening, months after the dust of court had settled, Rowan wore a small, plain ring he had saved for a long time. He had no showy words to go with it. He found Clara on the porch, threading a needle by lamplight. The cottonwoods moved outside and cast a leaf sound, the way a hymn might. Rowan sat and, with the simple pressure a man who knows the value of steadiness, asked if she would stand with him. Clara looked at the ring and then at him, and in her answer there was the clear practicality that had always marked her. A yes given not as a surrender, but as a mutual agreement of work and hope. Their marriage was small and honest, a gathering of neighbors under the barn's rafters, lamplight pooling like soft coins on the floor. Santos officiated with the practical blessing of someone who had watched the valley hold. There was a cake baked by Maggie Duncan, a borrowed dress for Clara that fit like a second skein, and a parade of handshakes that served as a public vow. We will stand with you, as you stood for us. June, too young to remember the terror of her first days, sat on a neighbor's knee and let the world be warm. It was not spectacle, it was repair made visible.
Children came in the years after. 2 small lives who learned to run the fence line and to know which ridge had good figs in fall. Rowan taught them to ride thunder with the same patience he'd been taught years before. Clara taught them the pattern of mending that turned a worn shirt into a story. The valley watched them grow as if into a promise kept. People spoke of the rescue day less as a wound than as a hinge in their histories, how one person's immediate willingness to act had made others decide to hold more tightly to one another. There were quieter reckonings too. Dawson Consenkadate never entirely vanished from regional maps. He owned acres and had men who still believed in his name. Power does not dissipate cleanly, but he found doors closed that had once been open, and his son Garrett carried the knowledge of a conviction that would be with him like a shadow. The valley recovered its spring and kept it better guarded. The Duncans found their cattle left to themselves and the fences steady. People who had thought of leaving the valley changed their minds. They saw with the slow clarity of weather that a place where neighbors defend one another is a place worth staying for. For Rowan, there was a private closure that arrived in small measures rather than one great moment. One late autumn, he walked with Clara to the river where he had once lost a boy and knelt. He did not speak of that place's old sorrow. He held out his hand to the water and let the current take a leaf he had saved months earlier, an insignificant ritual. Clara watched him, understanding that grief alters shape but does not vanish. She put her hand on his shoulder, and together they let the leaf go. It was not a cure, but a covenant. We will carry what is ours, and we will answer where we can. The valley's days passed. They were full of the practicalities of life, the smell of bread rising in ovens, the thump of a mallet mending a fence, children's laughter that came in small ripples against the cottonwoods. June grew into a girl who loved the sound of thunder's hooves and who had a habit of tying a ribbon in her hair in precise bows that flapped like little flags when she ran. Often she would run a circlet of friends along the fence where the rescue had happened and laugh as if the memory belonged to a story told at dusk rather than something that had narrowed a man and a woman into new care. On one of those late summer afternoons, many seasons after the bull's charge, Rowan stood at the fence and watched children play in the field. The grass had recovered and was green in a way the valley had not seen for a while. A boy ran with a ribbon in his hand, and as his feet skittered in the dust, the scene flickered in Rowan, as if life had come around on itself. He thought of the day the world narrowed to dust, and the hands that had reached for a child. He felt the echo in his chest like a steady drum. One decisive act had altered many days.
He had saved June because a man could not bear the alternative. In the act, he had been returned to himself in a different way. Clara joined him at the rail, quiet as cottonwood shade. She laid a hand by his, and together watched children who would grow with fewer fears of men with soft hands and hard intentions. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked once, simply, "about how different our days are?" Rowan looked across the field, where thunder grazed lazily under a fence post, flanks catching the sun. "Sometimes," he said, "mostly I think that people will choose how they live more than the land chooses for them. We chose to stand. That choice ripples." She smiled then, not at the sweep of his language, but at the thing the valley had reminded them. Sustaining a place is daily work, small and stubborn. The lamplight that would soon be lit in nearby houses promised a night of ordinary comforts, heated tins, quilts, and a quietness earned by honest labor. When the sun dipped low, the children were called in, and the cottonwoods made their leafy music. Rowan helped Clara coax June, now older, hair caught in a braid, inside, and they closed the door to the porch with the soft click of a settled lock. Inside, the Hail house glowed with lamplight that turned faces into calm relief. Santos boiled coffee and set cups on the table as if tending ritual. People came and went in the steady give and take of neighbors. The valley had been tested and had found itself capable of both restraint and defense. It had brought men to law and let law do its work. It had stitched ruptures with ordinary labor. That was its true strength, the ability to turn courageous moments into days of repair. The rescue, Rowan's act at the bull's charge, would be told at times with some exaggeration, as stories go. But what mattered for most of them was less dazzling: the way the valley decided that each day it would set its shoulders to small, useful tasks and hold one another. Years later, people would come to the fence and tell the story to newcomers in the valley as if it were a parable. They would say the words with the exactness of those who know them. When the bull charged, the brave cowboy saved a child from danger. They would tell it not to make romance with their history, but to remind themselves that courage, when joined with law and common-sense friendship, shapes a place. They would emphasize that the hands that rescued had been human hands, not miraculous, not ordained by anything but choice. They would say also that justice had its limits, and the community must always be practiced. Rowan and Clara grew old in a way that suits people who have given themselves to the ordinary, with hands that know each other's work, with laughter that slips in like sunlight through a port screen, with fears held in the small ways people offer one another comfort. The barn kept its rafters, and the river kept its flow.
The valley kept its watch, now less of necessity and more of habit,
because habits were the things that bound fences and hearts alike. On the afternoon that would be their son's first ride, Thunder patient and steady, Rowan stood and adjusted a saddle while Clara watched from the fence. June, grown and steady, tied her brother's scarf. The field where the bull had charged was a place of play, nets for boys and girls, a kite in the high air tugging on its string like a little claim. The cottonwoods trembled their leaves, and lamplight would later warm the house into the blue of evening. Rowan had no illusions that his action had been anything other than a human thing caught right, skill, timing, and a refusal to let cruelty go unchecked. He had no story of grandeur. The valley's healing was not the result of a single hand, but of many, mutual and earthly. Yet sometimes, when he watched the children run and the air held the small sense of bread on a neighbor's windowsill, he felt a soft, bright satisfaction. A life had been saved that day. A community had claimed itself because of it. And slowly, day by day, they had continued the work of living into a place that kept its own. As dusk settled and lamps lit the porches down the lane, the last sound was not thunder, but a child's laugh floating across the field. Rowan stood by the fence, Thunder's mane whispering against his palm. Clara's hand found his, as it had found it for years now, and together they watched as the valley's children chased a kite toward the wide sky. The story that would be told for years, of a bull, a charge, a brave cowboy, would end in the simplest of images. A field restored, a child playing, a community that learned to guard what it loved. If the world narrowed again, as it sometimes would, the valley knew how to answer, by calling the law, by tending the small in the ordinary, by taking up its work and stitching what needed mending, and most of all by keeping hands ready to act when the day demanded it, and by keeping those hands honest enough to hand those who did wrong to the law rather than to the rope. In that way, the rescue's true legacy was clear. Bravery joined with law and neighborliness could make a place where children belonged safely, and where the ordinary labors of repair carried the weight of healing. Subscribe for more cinematic true life stories, tales of courage that remind us how small acts shape the lives of many.